In the coming lectures, we are going to talk about so-called stored procedures. So first of all, let's talk about what is the motivation behind stored procedures, what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages of using stored procedures. So we have been talking about in one of the previous lecture that SQL is a non-procedural programming language by default, but with the help of stored procedures, we can create procedural-like scripts that can be executed at any time. So this is why sometimes SQL is identified as a non-procedural programming language and sometimes it is identified as a procedural programming language, because with the help of stored procedures, we can create procedural-like scripts. Stored procedures are relatively fast, of course not as fast as compiled languages such as C or C++, but anyways it is relatively fast, and the main speed gain comes from a reduction of network traffic. We are going to talk about it a bit later. What's crucial that stored procedures are stored on the server, and we can use stored procedures for repetitive tasks. So if we have to execute the same operation over and over again, for example, we would like to select the name of a given country and the population of a given country where the country code is equal to the United States of America, and finally we would like to sort the result dataset based on the country names. It is a relatively easy SQL query, but of course if we have to repeat it over and over again, then it will get quite frustrating. So this is why a bit better solution is to create a stored procedure that's going to fetch the given country with the given population where the country code is equal to the United States of America, and then every time we want to execute this operation, we just have to call the stored procedures exclusively. Okay, so this is why stored procedures are extremely powerful for repetitive tasks. And what's extremely crucial that we don't need to bother with high-level programming languages. We can implement the application in Java, in C, C++, C# or PHP when dealing with websites, for example. We don't care about the high-level programming language. We know for certain that we are dealing with a stored procedure that can be called with any high-level programming language. Of course, you may pose the question that why is it so crucial? Because, for example, let's suppose the situation that we write an application in Java and we hard-code all the database-related queries in Java. Then we come to the conclusion that we should modify the application, and instead of the Java programming language, we would like to use PHP. Then of course we have to restructure every single SQL query again. If we use stored procedures, then there is no need to update the SQL queries because it is stored on the server side in stored procedures. Okay, so stored procedures can centralize logic that was originally implemented in applications, and in order to save time and memory, extensive and rather complex processing that requires execution of several SQL statements can be saved into stored procedures, and all applications can call these procedures. Okay, so if we consider modern applications, we have the given application with the user interface components, buttons, text fields, and so on, and the application is communicating with a database that's present on a given server. And usually the application is communicating with the database with the help of the internet. And of course this is the bottleneck of the system, because for example if we use Java as the programming language, we create a web application with Java Enterprise Edition, with Spring Boot and so on, and we can create all the database related queries in Java. And what's going to happen? We are going to send these queries via the internet, and the database server is going to handle these queries, and of course the result is going to be returned to the application itself. Of course it is not a scalable solution because of the speed of the internet. So a bit better solution is to create stored procedures that's going to be present on the server right next to the database tables, and then the application is going to call the stored procedures. So in this case we are not going to send the whole query via the internet, we just call a given stored procedure and it is going to update the database tables, or it is going to return with the results. So this is why using stored procedures are extremely crucial in modern applications. Of course, there are several disadvantages of stored procedures. The first disadvantage is that, of course, stored procedures need memory. The second disadvantage is that MySQL is not that effective as far as procedural statements are concerned. So, for example, if MySQL has to handle if-else statements, then it is not going to be that effective, which means that it is going to rely heavily on the central processing unit. And the last disadvantage is that it is extremely hard to debug stored procedures. So, of course, as usual with other approaches, stored procedures has several advantages and disadvantages as well. So in the coming lectures, we are going to talk about how to write our own stored procedures. Thanks for watching. In the previous lecture, we have been talking about the theoretical background as far as stored procedures are concerned. We came to the conclusion that we can use SQL statements more or less in a procedural manner. So basically, we can group multiple SQL statements and we can execute them as a single logical unit. So first of all, we have to talk about the delimiter. So as far as SQL statements are concerned, we can execute them on a sequential manner. So if we select everything from the country database table and we use a semicolon, then we notify MySQL that it is going to be a single SQL query. If we execute it, then of course MySQL server is going to interpret that given SQL command and we will get every single row as far as the country database table is concerned. Of course, we can use multiple statements. For example, we would like to select everything from the city database table, and because we use the semicolon, this is how we separate these SQL commands. So if we run the query, then MySQL server is going to execute the first query and then it is going to execute the second query. So it is going to handle these statements independently. But of course, this is not what we are after. We would like to make sure that we are dealing with a single logical unit of execution consisting multiple SQL queries. So this is why we have to talk about the delimiter. And we have to use some special character, for example, the $$ or something like this. So what does it mean exactly? First of all, let's implement our first stored procedure, and then I am going to explain it on a step-by-step basis. So first of all, we have to define the delimiter, and this is how we can notify MySQL that we would like to execute multiple SQL statements as a single logical unit. So what do we have to do? First of all, we have to create procedure. We are going to give a name to our stored procedure. So for example, we have the get people stored procedure. We have to use something like this. This is the so-called parameter list, so we can define parameters, but we are going to talk about it in another lecture. What's crucial that this is going to be the name of our stored procedure. And then what do we have to do? We have to begin. Of course, we have to end as well. So this is where we can define the SQL commands one by one. We would like to select everything from the person database table. So this is how we can create the stored procedure itself. This is going to be the name of the stored procedure. We have to make sure that every single SQL query will be located right after the begin keyword and before the end keyword. So if we use something like this, then after the end keyword, we can use the $$ delimiter. And this is how we notify MySQL that everything within this $$ delimiter is going to be executed as a single logical unit. So MySQL is going to create a stored procedure for us with this name. It is going to interpret our implementation, which means that whenever we call the getPeople stored procedure, it is going to select every single row from the person database table and it is going to return with the result, and it is going to be executed as a single logical unit. After that, we can reinitialize the delimiter to be the semicolon. So usually the delimiter is the semicolon, but for the sake of the the stored procedure, we override the delimiter to be the $$ to be able to execute multiple statements as a single logical unit. So as you can see, it is a single SQL query with a semicolon, but it is not going to be executed as a single query because we use the $$ delimiter. And after that, we reset the delimiter to be the semicolon. So if we use something like this and execute the query, after that we can use this get people stored procedure. So what do we have to do? We have to use the call keyword and we have to define the name of the stored procedure we have defined. So we have the get people as far as the stored procedure is concerned. And if we run the query, then as you can see, MySQL is going to return every single row as far as the person database table is concerned, because this is how we have defined the get people stored procedure. This stored procedure is going to select every single row from the person database table, and this is why we end up with this result. Okay, so we have managed to construct our first stored procedure. In the next lecture, we are going to talk about how to check the stored procedures we have already implemented and how to remove existing stored procedures. Thanks for watching. In the previous lecture, we have been talking about how to create a stored procedure, and in this lecture, we are going to take a look how to check the existing stored procedures and how to remove an existing stored procedure. So what do we have to do? We can show procedure status. So if we run this SQL query, then it is going to list the stored procedures associated with that given database. As you can see, there are several system-related stored procedures, but if we check the last stored procedure, this is the stored procedure we have created in the previous lecture. So the name is the get people, there's the time when we have created that given stored procedure, and of course we can check the database the given stored procedure is associated with. So in this case, we have created the get people stored procedure in the Udemy database. So what if we would like to remove that given stored procedure? Okay, by the way, we can use wildcards. So if we know the name of the procedure we are looking for, then we can use like, and for example, we know for certain that there's a person in the name of the stored procedure, then we can use something like this. Of course, we have to make sure that it is a string, and if we run the query, then of course the result is going to be an empty list because I guess that we have the people. So we have the get people as far as the name of the stored procedure is concerned. So as you can see, it is working fine. Okay, so this is how we can look for a given stored procedure. And what if we would like to remove a given stored procedure? We can drop procedure, and we have to define the name of the procedure. So get people, this is the name of the stored procedure. As you can see, if we execute that query, it is working fine. So if we list all the active stored procedures and we check the last one, then as you can see, we have managed to remove the get people stored procedure. So this is how we can create a stored procedure. This is how we can list all the stored procedures associated with a given database. And this is how we can remove existing stored procedures. By the way, whenever we remove, so whenever we drop a given procedure, we can use if exists, because of course if we want to remove a stored procedure that not exists, so for example we drop the procedure get people, there's going to be an error. So as you can see, error code procedure Udemy get people doesn't exist. But if we use the drop procedure if exists, then it's going to work just fine. There's going to be a warning instead of an error message. Okay, so this is how we can remove a given stored procedure. Thanks for watching. In this lecture, we are going to talk about variables. And of course, you may pose the question that what is a variable? Basically, variables can store given values. So let's take a look at a concrete example. So for example, we can declare a given variable. For example, the total cities, we can use this notation, or we can use camel casing, whatever. In this case, I am going to use camel casing for the variable notation. So we declare the total number of cities, or just total, as an integer. And of course, we can define a default value. So if we use default 0, it means that we are going to create a variable with name total. It is going to be an integer and the initial value will be 0. Okay, so this is how we declare the variable itself. How to set a given value? We can use the set keyword and, for example, set total is equals to 10. This is how we can update the value of the total variable to be 10. So it is going to store the integer 10. Okay, so let's take a look at a concrete example. First of all, we have to use the delimiter as usual. So we use the $sign. Then we have to create procedure. We have the count cities. This is going to be the name of the stored procedure. Then we have the begin, and of course we have the and keyword as well with the $sign. So this is exactly what we have been talking about in the previous lecture, that we would like to handle everything in between the two $signs as a single logical unit of execution. So what do we have to do? First of all, we would like to declare a total variable as an integer with default value 0. Okay. Then we want to select, and we would like to count the number of cities as far as the city database table is concerned, but it is absolutely crucial that we would like to make sure that the result is going to be stored in the total variable. So we can use the select into statement. So we select count star into the variable total from the city database table. And of course, after that, we would like to select the total variable. So basically what's going to happen, we are going to create a store procedure with name count cities. It is going to create a total variable with default value 0. Then we will count the number of cities as far as the city database table is concerned. And of course, we would like to make sure that the result is going to be stored in the total variable. And then we select the total. So basically, it is going to be the result of the stored procedure. And of course, finally, we reinitialize the delimiter to be the semicolon. So if we use something like this and run the query, then as you can see, it is successful. So what do we have to do? We have to call the count cities stored procedure. And if we use something like this, then of course the result is going to be the total variable. So there's going to be a single column with name total with 4079. And of course we can do the same if we select the count and star from the city database table, and of course we are going to get the same value, as you can see. The difference is that here we use a standard SQL query, while on the other hand we can use a store procedure in order to achieve the same result. Okay, so this is how we can declare variables. By the way, these are called local variables because these variables exist within the store procedure. Of course, we are not able to access the total variable outside the scope of the store procedure, hence the name local variable. Anyways, we are going to talk a bit more about variables in the main in one of the coming lectures. It is absolutely crucial that we can create, for example, decimals or just DEC, for example 10 and 2. This is exactly what we have been talking about in one of the first lectures of this course. The default value can be, for example, 10.0, and it is going to work just fine. That's all about local variables. Thanks for watching. In the previous lecture, we have been talking about store procedures, and we have been talking about how to define variables. These are the so-called local variables. In this lecture, we are going to talk about the so-called session variables. So first of all, what is a session? Whenever a given application, so the client, accesses the MySQL database server, basically there's going to be a new session. For example, we would like to insert a new item into a database table. Then what's going to happen? We are going to connect the MySQL database server, and we tell MySQL with the help of a SQL query that we would like to update a given database table. And of course, after that, we terminate the given connection. And this is a given session. So basically, a session starts with opening a connection to the database server, and it terminates whenever we close that given connection. So this is called a session, and we can define variables within a given session, which means that we can access and modify the value of that given variable within the same session. Of course, we are not able to access or modify a session variable from another session. Okay, so this is how we can create variables within a session. And what do we have to do? First of all, we don't need to declare, as we have seen when dealing with stored procedures. We can set the value explicitly, and we have to use something like this. We have to use the @ symbol, and then we can give a name to the variable. For example, we have the value, it is equals to 12, for example. And then of course we can select that given value, so basically we can print out the value. So whenever we run the query, then MySQL is going to initialize this variable with the value 12, and then we can print out the value, and as you can see, it has the value 12. Of course, we can use a string. For example, my name is Kevin. If we rerun this SQL query, then the value is going to be my name is Kevin. This is called a session variable, which means that we can access and modify this value within the same session. Of course, we can override a value. So if we set again, for example, my name is Joe, and we run these queries, then of course my name is Joe is going to be the final result. First of all, the value will be my name is Kevin, but after that we update the value to be my name is Joe. So if we print out the value, then my name is Joe will be the result. So this is how we can define session variables, and it is going to be crucial in the next lecture. Thanks for watching. In the previous lecture, we have been talking about session variables, and in this lecture we are going to talk about parameters. There may be several types of parameters. We can define so-called in parameters, we can define so-called out parameters, and there is the in-out parameter. So we are going to talk about just the in and the out parameters. So whenever we create a store procedure, of course, we can define the parameters when calling the given store procedure. For example, we would like to get all the countries where the country code is equal to the United States of America, then we can define this country code as a parameter. Hence, we can call this store procedure with any parameters, United States of America or Hungary, or for example, India, whatever. As far as the in parameter is concerned, it is going to be an input parameter in the sense that the store procedure is going to create a copy of that given variable. As far as the out variable is concerned, the store procedure is going to modify the value and going to return the value of that given variable. So let's take a look at a concrete example, and I guess it's going to be clear. So first of all, let's define the delimiter as usual for the $, and let's create procedure, for example, count the number of cities. So here we can define the parameter. This is the so-called parameter list. So usually we use something like this. We have to define that it is an in parameter. This is going to be the name of country, or just for example the country code. That's going to be a char as far as 3 characters are concerned. And we are going to define an output as far as the total is concerned. It is going to be an integer. And of course, after that we have to begin and end. Of course, we have to use the $, so it is going to be a single logical unit of execution. And of course, then we set the delimiter back to a semicolon. So what do we have to do? We have to define the select statement. We select the number of cities. So we are going to count everything into the total variable. So let's use something like this. Of course, from the city database table, where we have the country code is equals to the code. Sorry for that, we have the, for example, we have the country. So let's use the country code like this. It is going to be just the country, and we have to use something like this. So it is going to be a SQL select. So as you can see, we have the city database table with these columns: ID, name, country code, district, and population. So we are going to count the number of cities based on a given country code. Okay, so if we use something like this and we run the query, I guess it is going to work fine. The problem is that this stored procedure already exists. So what do we have to do? We have, for example, count total cities, something like this. If we rerun the store procedure, then it is going to work fine. So what do we have to do? We just have to run this count total cities stored procedure. So let's try to run it without any parameters. If we try to run the store procedure, then incorrect number of arguments. So here we have to define the parameters. For example, United States of America is going to be the so-called in parameters. So this is what we have been talking about. So if we try to run, then again, it is incorrect number of arguments. And here we can use a session variable as far as the total is concerned. So what's going to happen? We are going to use a total variable, and we are going to store the total number of cities associated with a given country code in this variable. So what do we have to do? After that, we can select the total variable. So let's run both of these queries, and as you can see, it is equals to 274. If we try to call the number of cities as far as Hungary is concerned, if we rerun the query, there are 9 cities associated with Hungary. So this is how we can define an in parameter that's going to be an input, and we can define a so-called out parameter that's going to be an argument in this stored procedure, but it is absolutely crucial that it is going to return with a given value. So if we take a look again at the store procedure, then this is what we have been talking about in this lecture, that as far as the parameter list is concerned, we can define in parameter that's going to store a given value we would like to use during the store procedure. This is exactly what's happening here. We would like to store the country code in a variable because as far as the given select is concerned, we are going to use this value. And we need the so-called out parameter, the so-called total. It is another variable as far as the store procedure is concerned, but it is absolutely crucial that after the select operation, we would like to use the value we have calculated outside the scope of the store procedure, and this is why we have to use an out parameter. Okay, so whenever we call the count total cities, we can define the in parameter as the country code, and we can define a session variable. This is exactly what we have been talking about in the previous lecture. Session variable is not bound to a stored procedure. We can access the value of a session variable within a given session, so outside the scope of a given stored procedure. So we define this total session variable. The stored procedure is going to count the number of cities associated with a given country code, and the stored procedure stores that given value in this session variable. So this is why we can access that given value outside the scope of the store procedure. Okay, so this is the crucial difference between in parameters and out parameters. Thanks for watching. In this lecture, we are going to talk about so-called conditional statements or if-else statements. So what does it mean exactly? We can execute a given SQL statement based on a given condition. So if the condition is true, then we can execute something. And of course, we have to end the if statement. And basically, that's all about the if statement. We can check if a given condition is true. If it is true, then MySQL server is going to execute a given query. Otherwise, MySQL server is not going to execute that given query. So for example, we are going to consider countries, and where the population is greater than 100 million, then we create a variable that's going to represent that it is a country with high population. So let's take a look at a concrete implementation, and it's going to be clear. So first of all, we have to define the delimiter as usual. We create a procedure, for example, the label country. As far as the parameter is concerned, we are going to have an in parameter. For example, the country, it is going to be a char with 3 characters, and we have the out variable that's going to be a label itself with varchar and, for example, 20. Okay, so let's take a look at the concrete implementation. What do we have to do? We will need a begin and an end statement with the double dollar delimiter. And what do we have to do? Of course, we have to create a variable, so declare total population is equals to an integer with default value 0. This is what we have been talking about in one of the previous lectures, that this is how we can define a local variable within a given store procedure. And then what do we have to do? Of course, we have to create a select. So I would like to select not everything, but we are going to talk about the population column as far as the country table is concerned. So we have the population from the country database table, and of course we have to define where the country code, or sorry for that, we have the code itself. So this is the code of the given country containing 3 letters A, B, W, A, F, G, A, G, O, and so on. So where the code is equals to the country. And we select the population, and sorry for that, we select the population into the total population variable from the country where the code is equals to the country code. So with the help of this select, we are going to put the total population associated with a given country code into the total population variable. For just demonstration purposes, the variable name is equals to total, and then we can use the if statement. So if the total is greater than, for example, 100 million, let's see, I guess we have to use something like this. This is 100 million. Then we would like to set the label to be equals to a large country. Something like this. We are going to update the label we have defined here. So as you can see, we have defined the label as an out parameter, as a varchar 20. So we can use something like this. Okay, and of course we have to end with the if statement. Okay, so if we use something like this, sorry for that, we have to reinitialize the delimiter. If we use something like this and run the query, then of course there's going to be an error, undeclared variable, the total population, because we have renamed it to be total. If we rerun, then it is working fine, as you can see. So what do we have to do? Of course, we have created our store procedure. We can call this label country. So let's call the label country as far as the store procedure is concerned. Of course, we can define, for example, Hungary, and of course, we can define a session variable for the label. So we have the label, and then we can select the label. This is how we print out the value of the label. Okay, so if we run these queries, then of course the label is not going to store any value because the population of Hungary doesn't exceed 100 million. But for example, if we are dealing with the United States of America and we rerun the store procedure and then we print out the label, as you can see, the label will store the value large country because the population of the United States of America is greater than 100 million. So for example, if we rerun the store procedure with Argentina, of course the value of the label is a null. Why? Because the population of Argentina is smaller than 100 million. What if we are dealing with India? Of course the population of India is way larger than 100 million, so it is considered to be a large country. Okay, so this is how we can use the if statement, and by the way, we can use the if else statement. So what's going to happen here? If the total population is greater than 100 million, then we set the label to be large country, and we can say that else we would like to set the label to be small country. something like this. So what's going to happen? MySQL server is going to check this given condition. If it is true, then MySQL sets the label to be a large country, and that's the end of the if statement. But if this condition is false, then MySQL is going to execute this part of the code, which means that the label will store the value small country. I am going to copy this store procedure because of course we have already created the label country store procedure. So what do we have to do? Drop procedure, and we have the label country. If we use something like this, as you can see, we have dropped this store procedure, so we can redefine this store procedure. And if we run the query, then I guess it is going to work just fine. Okay, so what do we have to do? We just have to call this store procedure label country. For example, as far as Hungary is concerned, we have to define the so-called session variable label, and then we have to select the label accordingly. The population of Hungary is smaller than 100 million, so we should get the result small country. As far as, for example, Germany is concerned, I guess Germany is a relatively small country as well. As far as the United States of America is concerned, it is a large country. So this is how we can use if-else statements based on a given condition in order to set different values to the same variable. Okay, so that's all about conditional statements. Thanks for watching. In this lecture, we are going to talk about how to use loops. And basically, with the help of loops, we can execute multiple operations on a sequential manner. So for example, we would like to print the first 10 integers starting with 1. Then we can create a loop and we can print 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 10. So this is when loops can prove to be extremely useful when we want to execute multiple operations. So let's take a look at a concrete example. Let's use the delimiter $$ as usual. Let's create a procedure, for example, loop example. We are not going to use any arguments. So what do we have to do? We have a begin, and then we have an end with the $, and then we reinitialize the delimiter to be the semicolon. Okay. First of all, we are going to declare a given variable, for example, the variable a, that's going to be an integer with default value 1, just for demonstration purposes. And then we declare a string, so a variable length character. Okay, so something like this. Of course, we have to make sure that there's not going to be any typos. And then we can define the loop itself. What do we have to do? We can give a name or a label to the given loop. So we have the loop label. It is the loop itself. Of course, we have to end the loop, so this is how we can terminate the loop. And within the loop and the end loop statement, we can define the operation we would like to execute multiple times. In every single iteration, we are going to increment the value of a by 1. So we set the value of a, so this is the variable, as an integer as we have declared here. The default value is 1. So in the first iteration, it has the value 1. Then we keep incrementing the value by 1 in every single iteration. So in the second iteration, it will have the value 2, then 3, 4, and so on. And of course, in every single iteration, we will update the value of the string, and we call the concat. The concat stands for concatenation. It is a built-in method in MySQL that's going to concatenate two strings. We will use the string s, and we will concatenate the value of the integer, and we are going to separate them by a white space character. So basically, in the first iteration, it is going to store the string 1, then in the second iteration 1 and 2, then 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So this is going to be the result. And of course, it is going to be an infinite loop because MySQL server is going to execute the statements within the loop and the end loop statements infinitely. So this is why we have to define an if statement. This is exactly what we have been talking about in one of the previous lectures, that if the value of a is greater than 10, then we have to leave the loop label. So what does it mean exactly? If you are familiar with procedural programming languages, such as Java for example, then it is the break statement. So this is how we notify MySQL that we would like to break out of the loop. So we would like to terminate the iteration and we would like to continue with the execution here, for example. Okay, so after the loop, we are going to select a as the value. So what's going to happen? Basically, we are going to declare two variables, an integer with default value 1 and the given string. Then we create a loop. What does it mean exactly? That we are going to execute multiple statements in every single iteration. So first of all, we increment the value of the integer by 1 and then we update the string as a concatenation of the actual string and the integer separated by a whitespace character. And of course, we have to make sure that it is not going to be an infinite loop, so we check that if a is greater than 10, then we leave the loop label. What is the loop label? The loop label is going to identify the loop itself. So if we specify the leave keyword, then MySQL is going to terminate the loop itself and going to execute other operations. In this case, we have just a single operation as far as printing out the value of the integer. So if we run this store procedure, I guess it is going to work fine. So what do we have to do? We have to call the loop example. So let's call the loop example. Of course, we don't have to update the delimiter. So if we use something like this and execute the query, then we are going to end up with 11. And of course, it is working fine because we selected the incremented integer and the value is indeed 11. Okay, I made a mistake because I would like to select the string itself. Okay, so this is the first update, and what's extremely crucial is that we have to set the initial value for the string. So let's set s to be an empty string at the beginning. So if we use something like this and rerun the query, then of course it is going to work just fine. So if we call the store procedure, then I guess it is going to work just fine. So let's take a look at the result. We should get 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Let's take a look at all the values and 11. So these are the values that are going to be concatenated with the original string. So if we take a look at the implementation, we create two variables, a and s. A is an integer, s is going to be an empty string at the beginning. The default value for the integer is equals to 1. And then we are going to loop, which means that we are going to execute multiple statements. So because a is not greater than 10, we are going to increment the value of a and we are going to concatenate it with the actual string. So this is why the first value is 2. Then we have a whitespace character, as you can see. So 2 whitespace character, 3 whitespace character, 4 whitespace character, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. What's going to happen if a is greater than 10? In this case, we are going to leave the loop, so we have a loop label that's going to identify the loop itself. So we break out of the loop and then we select s, which means that we would like to print out the value of the s string itself. And this is why we end up with the value like this. You may pose the question that why do we print out 11 when we have the if statement with this condition? And of course, because we increment the value here by 1, so whenever a is equals to 10, we increment the value by 1, 11, and then we append 11 to the s string. So this is why 11 is also part of the string. So this is how we can use loops, and what's absolutely crucial that we have to make sure that it is not going to be an infinite loop. So we have to check whether the given condition is met, and if a given condition is met, then we have to leave the given loop. Okay, in the next lecture we are going to talk about iterate keyword. Thanks for watching. In the previous lecture, we have been talking about the loop keyword, so how to execute multiple operations with the help of loops, how to use the leave keyword in order to break out of a loop, and in this lecture we are going to talk about the iterate keyword. So if you are familiar with procedural programming languages such as C++ or Java, then this is the so-called continue keyword. So for example, we keep incrementing the value of a, and then we can check that if a is equals to 3, for example, then we would like to iterate, and we have to define the loop label. And of course, it is going to be the end of the if statement. So what's going to happen? Whenever MySQL executes the iterate keyword, then it is going to execute the next iteration in the loop, and it is not going to execute the operations after the iterate keyword. So what's going to happen? We are going to increment the value of a. So in the first iteration it is 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And if the a is equals to 3, then the iterate keyword is going to continue with the next iteration without concatenating the actual integer to the given string. So what's going to happen? 3 will not be part of the integers as far as the string is concerned. So if I run this stored procedure, then I guess it is going to work just fine. We have to call the loop example, and I guess it is going to work just fine. So as you can see, we have 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. What does it mean exactly? The integer with value 3 is missing. And of course, because of the iterate keyword. So because if a is equals to 3, we call the iterate keyword on the loop. So what does it mean? That this part of the code is not going to be executed, which means that 3 as an integer is not going to be appended to the s string. And of course, this is exactly the result: 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on. So this is how we can continue with the next iteration as far as a given loop is concerned with the help of the iterate keyword. Thanks for watching. In this lecture, we are going to talk about the so-called while loop. So in the previous lecture, we have been talking about how to execute multiple operations with the help of loops. In this lecture, we are going to talk about a very similar approach, the so-called while loops. So first of all, let's use the delimiter. As far as the $$ is concerned, we create a procedure. So create procedure, for example, loop example again. We are not going to have any arguments. We will have a begin and an end with the $, and then we reinitialize the delimiter to be the semicolon. So what do we have to do? Of course, we are going to define variable, so declare a variable a that's going to be an integer with default value 0 in this case, and we are going to declare a string that's going to be a variable length varchar. The default value will be an empty string. Okay, something like this. And what do we have to do? We are going to iterate, so while the length is a built-in function in MySQL that's going to calculate the length of a given string. So for example, if we have hello, then the length of this string is equals to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because there are 5 characters as far as this string is concerned. If we have, for example, hi, then of course the length of this string is equals to 2 because there are 2 characters in this string. Okay, so while the length of the s string is smaller than 5, then we would like to do the following, and of course we need the and while loop. So what's going to happen? We are going to increment the value. So set a to be a plus 1. We increment the value of the variable a. And then we update the string. So set s to be the concatenation of s and a. For example, without a white space. So we are going to use an empty string basically. And after that, of course, we are going to select the given s string. So this is the while loop basically. It is very similar to a standard loop we have been talking about in the previous lecture. But what's going to happen? MySQL is going to check this condition and it is going to execute the operations within the while loop if the given condition is true. If the given condition becomes false, then the while loop terminates and MySQL keeps executing other operations after the while loop. So in this case, for example, we keep incrementing the value of a. So we increment it to be 1 and we concatenate it with the string. So in the first iteration, we will have something like this. Of course, the length of the string is equals to 1, so we keep going. We keep appending 2, then 3, 4, and so on. So if we run this store procedure, it is working fine. Okay, and what do we have to do? We have to call the loop example without any arguments. And if we save and run it, as you can see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So if we take a look at the implementation again, then it is quite straightforward what's happening. MySQL is going to check the condition. If the condition is true, then it executes the operations within the while loop. Otherwise, it terminates the while loop. So this is why we have 1, then 2, 3, 4, and 5. Of course, we are not going to append any more integers because the length of the string would be greater than 5. Okay, so that's all about the while loop. Thanks for watching. In this lecture, we are going to talk about how to return multiple values from a stored procedure. Of course, we have to use multiple out variables, but anyways, let's take a concrete example. So we are going to use the delimiter as usual, the $sign. We will have to create a new procedure, for example, multiple values. Okay, of course, there's going to be a parameter list. So first of all, we have to define the country code. So it is going to be the country. So first of all, we have to define an out parameter as far as the, for example, population counter is concerned. So we have a population counter and we have a life expectancy counter. So we have something like this, and of course it is an integer and the life counter is an integer as well. Okay, so what do we have to do? We have a begin, then we have an end with the $sign, and we have to reinitialize the delimiter to be the semicolon. So what do we have to do? Basically, we have to define two select statements. First of all, we have to select and count the population. So for example, I am going to select and count everything into the population counter from the country database table, of course. So country is the database table we are considering. And of course, where the population, for example, is greater than 100 million. So this is going to be the first select. Basically, we make sure that the result is going to be stored in the population counter. So this is when we can use the select statement combined with the into keyword, which means that in this case, the result is going to be put into the population counter variable. And we have another select. So we select the count everything, so we use the star, into the life counter, of course from the country database table where life expectancy is greater than 70, for example. Okay, this is going to be the second select statement, and basically that's all. So what do we have to do? First of all, we have to make sure that it is working fine. Let's take a look at it. We have a store procedure with multiple values as the name. We have two out parameters, the population counter, the life counter, and then we begin and make two select statements. We select everything into the population counter, yeah, and we select everything into the life counter. So let's take a look whether it is working fine or not. Okay, so it is working fine. So what do we have to do? We have to call the multiple values, and then we have to use a counter C1, for example, for the population, and we have to use another variable for the life expectancy. And of course, then we have to select the C1 and the C2 parameters. So if we use something like this and run the query, then as you can see, the first result is 10, the second result is 111, which means that there are 10 countries in the world that has larger population than 100 million, and there are 111 countries where the life expectancy is greater than 70. Okay, so this is how we can get multiple values in a stored procedure. Thanks for watching.